So, welcome to the Inspire369 podcast. Today, we have a truly exciting guest joining us, Richard Leviton, a visionary researcher, author, and trained clairvoyant who delves deep into the mysteries of our planet and its spiritual dimensions. Richard is renowned for his extensive work on geomancy, sacred landscapes, and the intricate ways the Earth's design influences our spiritual evolution. He is the author of 34 books, such as Welcome to Your Designer Planet, and his work has captivated readers by exploring how sacred sites and ley lines contribute to our collective and individual consciousness. Today, he's here to share insights into how these powerful energies shape our experiences in the very fabric of our reality. Richard, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so why don't we start with just a little background on you? Like, how did you get started in this work? What's your bio?
Well, I was trained for about 18 years as a Zen Buddhist, and in that tradition, they hit you with sticks if you have any kind of a vision or even talk about such things. And then I reached a point where I said, I've had enough of this, and I went off to England wanting to write a book in my fantasy notion suitable for the New Yorker as to the current status of the King Arthur myth. As soon as I got there, that notion went out the window because I got thrown into the deep end of the angelic realm, the genuine geomantic realm, and basically all the mysteries of the earth. And the New Yorker would never have published anything like that, so I had to reorient myself. And then I met a few English people, and they're both clairvoyant. And as soon as we got together, this obviously we had prearranged this angelic family called the Ofanim, which means wheels, took us on and tutored me for what's been 40 years now in mysteries of the earth, energy designs, and, initiation protocols. So that's pretty much how it started. Professionally, I was a journalist. I've been writing since I was a teenager, and I wrote for magazines and all that stuff. So that was like in espionage language, you'd call that was my cover story or my legend.
Nice. So who are the Ofanim? Are they? I'm familiar with the term from. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Enochian magic, but John Dee and those. Yeah. So they talked about working with the Ofanim, and I from what I understand, there's different hierarchies of angels, right?
Well, in actual fact, there's 40 families of angels. The traditional knowledge says there's 10, but there's 40. And there's a hierarchy of knowledge, or again, using espionage language, to what degree they've been read into the total program. And the Ofanim were the second created angelic family. The one that was first created, there's a Hebrew name for it, but in English, they're called the Holy Lives. And those are the funny looking guys with 4 heads, an eagle, a man angel, a lion, and I forget the other one. And in Ezekiel's famous vision in the Bible of wheels within wheels and the 4-headed angels sticking out from them, the wheels were the Ofanim and the 4-headed ones were these first created angels. So in terms of the light grid of the earth, the Ofanim are essential, primary, and indispensable. It's not even like saying it's a brand name or anything. It's because one of their purposes in terms of why, let's say, the Supreme Being created them, was to act as a tutorial interface between consciousness and light grid designs on behalf of maintaining the physical aspects of a planet. And it also has to do with levels of umbillicus for both humans, planets, and even galaxies, and they maintain those things too. And even though they're not a well-known family, they like to be private. They don't like to be in the forefront. They're like the Taoists saying they lead from behind. Some of their mythic metaphorical images are quite popular. You may have heard of Ganesh, the jolly elephant god sitting on his butt and holding lots of gifts. That's them. Garuda, the celestial august bird or eagle that flies. I forget. I think it's Vishnu and Shri, his feminine counterpart. That's the blaises. If you've ever read the Ramayana, it's a big classic from India, there was this giant monkey god called Hanuman. That was them. So they've shown up in a lot of guises that a lot of people might be familiar with, but they may not realize it was a metaphor for a big gang of these angels. When I say gang, the different angelic orders have all been given permission to make a specific number of copies of themselves. Actually really down, it's like these guys, God's a real bean counter, you might say. The Ofanim get 1.2 billion copies, which sounds like a lot, but another angelic order called the Elohim, which are mid-level management, so to speak, they get 1,746 to the 9th power copies. So there's quite a spectrum of both knowledge and copies, because they don't serve only the Earth. They serve, according to the Ofanim, 18 billion galaxies and all the planets that have sentient life on them. So it's a big operation.
Yeah, geez, that's crazy. That's pretty impressive. So what is the ultimate purpose is kind of maintaining balance, maintaining harmony, kind of, and you said acting as that interface. I think maybe it's good to break that down a little bit for our viewers. Like what is a light grid? What is the Earth light grid? Why does it exist?
A light grid is the technical term to describe a kind of geometric pattern that is like a grid, like an XY axis, except it's much more complicated than that, made of light, that acts as a kind of armature or infrastructure or an encompassing lace doily around the planet. It facilitates all the aspects of the physical world and consciousness. It's equivalent to the human etheric body, which people don't normally see it, but it contains a complete blueprint of each individual person according to their karma design and the general generic design of a human. And if you lose your etheric body, you're dead. So just like, and technically, and I'm sure a lot of scientists will disagree with this, the light grid of the planet preceded the emergence of the physical planet, because energy always precedes matter, or I should say the subtler levels of energy precede the denser levels of matter, like, our bodies and the Earth. The purpose was, well, here's something. It's not so much maintaining things. It's more like facilitating evolution of awareness or consciousness. And here's sort of a big picture. The Ofanim told me once that roughly they superintend 18 billion galaxies, give or take a few. And, if you figure even one planet per solar system for each star, it's a vast number of planets. But of this vast number of planets, only 6 have been given a high degree of freedom and consciousness and light grid design, and Earth is one of them. So Earth is one of 6 planets out of the known universe that has, let's say, the top level kind of design. And the design is for consciousness. In other words, for humans to, over time, gradually, incrementally evolve into a kind of angelic state of complete panoptic awareness, but while still being in bodies. And in the condition and under the challenge of free will. That's tricky, because on the one hand, it means you can do whatever you want. On the other hand, it means the celestial agencies or good guys, the Great White Brotherhood and angelic hierarchy, cannot directly intervene, because that would contradict the covenant of free will. Very tricky business, because most people, if they thought about it, might be wishing for some kind of intervention in recent years, but they're only allowed to sort of nudge things sideways because of that free will covenant. And that free will was represented mythically in the picture of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's sort of like if you're at a smorgasbord, you have a choice of light meat and dark meat, so to speak, or you could do deeds that are good or evil. And to rescue that from a cartoon definition according to religion, I would say good deeds are ones that foster Christ consciousness in people. Bad deeds are one that suppress it. And when I say Christ consciousness, I'm not referring to the brand name logo of Christianity. I'm referring to more the way Rudolf Steiner talked about the Christ as a cosmic fact. And other cultures have different names like Vishnu, and that's the prominent one in Hinduism. So I'm using it in that term. So the light grid is both the means of maintaining the physical aspects of the world and consciousness, both in nature and humans, and also facilitating a gradual evolution of humans into a greater awareness of their original generic design. Because people will be quite surprised to sort of discover that both the planet and humanity are not accidents. The planet is not an accident of collisions, and humans are not just an outgrowth of monkeys. So Darwin can take a hike. It's really not a model that is congruent with the light grid. And maybe I'll make one more point. Most people have heard of the Hermetic axiom, as above, so below. That's from Hermes, a Greek guy that was involved in relations like that. But it's actually missing a part. It should say, as above, so below, and in the middle too. And what that means is there's a triple copying of the same design. The above means the heavenly realms or the celestial realms and all of its architecture and anatomy. The below is us, because we're copies of that. If you follow astrology, that's the metaphysical basis for it. And then the middle is the planet. The earth has the same design as the human, and both of us have the same design as the celestial world. It's been edited and adjusted a little bit because it's too big a design to copy completely, but let's say it's a curated, edited, perfectly well-selected design for consciousness to evolve on a planet with these physical conditions and with the kind of light grid we have. So that actually explains how you can interact with the planet through the light grid, because if you have as above, so below, and in the middle too, that's resonance. It means all three levels are automatically and instantaneously interactive, and you interact with them with your focused consciousness, and the Ofanim teach you how to do that. So it ties the whole picture together.
Fascinating. So the Earth is a living being. It has a light grid or an etheric body. Do the other planets, how do the other planets play into that, at least in our solar system, astrologically speaking?
Well, I can't speak to whether there's life forms on any of those other planets, so I haven't particularly researched it, and there's so many different opinions and scientific so-called knowledge about it. But I will say this. Most people are aware that there is an asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. Right? Where those asteroids come from? They came from a planet that blew up. That planet was anciently called Maldek, Maldek. Probably had a lot of other names. That was actually the first place that humanity was installed upon, between Mars and Jupiter. And things went badly. The people running the planet, so to speak, they had a hydrogen-based energy system, which also was dovetailed into the light grid system, which is way beyond anything we have on the Earth. And the management got seduced by what Steiner would call dark lodges of the galaxy to speed up evolution because it was boring. It was too slow from their point of view. Anyway, it ended badly and the planet imploded. They had to find a new planet, a replacement planet for the souls that got evicted from their blown up planet. And Earth was the replacement planet. It's probably a better one. It's closer to the sun. Maldek was, much further away between Mars and Jupiter. And curiously, there was this mathematician, I forget his name, but he came up with a famous law that talked about the necessary distances between planets in our solar system, and said, according to my theory, there had to have been a planet between Mars and Jupiter. Well, the asteroid belt's the remnant of it. So in a sense, we're on a replacement planet, but my impression is that it's probably better designed than Maldek and is a bigger gradient of challenge for humanity to match it. And unfortunately, in current times, humanity is sort of failing to match it. It's not totally humanity's fault. Religion and education and everything that passes for being an educated person is pretty much opposed to being in resonance with the light grid. So it's a bit of a problem.
Yeah, I've heard the similar thing about Mars, how there was, used to be an Earth-like planet, And well, there's a channeling called the Law of One. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but they speak about how it was, a very warlike planet, and they destroy their environment, and then those beings had to come to a new planet as well. And so, in addition to the planet Maldek, also the Martian beings had to come to Earth too. And so that was one of the transfers, so to speak.
Well, let me expand on that notion. The Ofanim told me once that demographically speaking, there was a greater diversity of soul origin of people on the Earth than on any other planet. Think of Los Angeles, but on a planetary scale, or New York City. People are from everywhere. Or the United States. The United States is basically the rest of the world. Everyone's here, right?
Yeah.
All the other countries and ethnicities are represented here. The Earth has drawn a demographic sampling of souls, well, just about everywhere, which is why there's such, some people would say bizarre, others would say fascinating spectrum of humans and human behavior, even though they all occupy the same generic body design.
Yeah.
It's because they all come from wildly different places with different expectations and backgrounds and emphases, and they all have to essentially fit into the light grid model of the Earth. It's not a coercive thing, but if you don't manage to sort of become congruent with it, you won't be comfortable here, and you just won't bother to reincarnate.
Yeah.
But, it's a very demographically rich planet.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And just in terms of richness, it's variety of life too. I've read in a book by, I'm forgetting her name. I think it's Barbara Malchek. She wrote Bringers of the Dawn, very, very popular channeling book from the 90s. She channeled a group called the Pleiadians. And in one of her books, they mention that the Earth is one of 6 planets, just like you mentioned, and that house a variety of life as a storehouse, as a kind of garden, so to speak, as the biological potential. Other beings, other races contribute DNA, contribute species in order to store them as a safe house, so to speak. I don't know if you've come across that at all in any of your work, or if that resonates or makes sense.
I'm familiar with that. Let me expand on that idea, if I may.
Yeah.
The key thing to know about the Earth is that it was designed, especially the light grid. Just think of like a room of engineers designing a light grid to superimpose over a planet. Meticulously curated. I mean, we're talking enormous amount of detail, 600 different types of light temples with thousands of copies of each laid in. It's more intricate than the body. I mean, the body's pretty intricate if you ask any surgeon or acupuncturist. And there were 8 principal, what we call alien or ET agencies, although those terms are sort of cartoon terms, that were principal designers, part of the principal design team. The Pleiadians were one of those, and the Pleiadians contributed, yes, some DNA. They contributed a lot of, let's say, engineering knowledge regarding how to sort of script or code light features to then interact with matter. But you have to, I know the Pleiadians are sort of the glamour go-to alien family these days. I think it's probably because it's the only one people have heard of. Yeah. Sort of like when people channel Saint Germain or Archangel Michael, I think it's because they haven't heard of all the other ones. But nonetheless, it's not all Pleiadians. It's more like a specialized engineering branch. Let's say, let's take an analogy. Let's say there was the equivalent of MIT on one of the planets in the Pleiades. So the light grid designers would have all come from that MIT university context. It's not, and they might have, it was my impression they had sort of a specialized mental development, and even they didn't quite look like the rest of the Pleiadians. So we have to be careful. And then it's even further complicated because there are bad Pleiadians. There's a bifurcation in the Pleiadian consciousness that was never resolved, and it got transferred to the Earth. Metaphorically, it's a little bit like the Cain and Abel myth in the Bible. One good guy and one bad guy. One of them murdered the other and basically invented murder, or the downfall of humanity and all the rest of it. Well, part of what we've been dealing with on the Earth is residual Pleiadian karma that was never resolved. even aliens aren't perfect. I guess that's the issue here.
Sure.
And there are some light temples on the Earth. There's a couple near Santa Fe that are actually outposts for Pleiadians. The other celestial families also have light temples. Those include Orion, the Great Bear, Cygnus, Cepheus. That's a constellation people haven't heard of too much. Arcturus. I'm forgetting a few. Anyway, there's 8. And they all have light temples where you could actually go there. And if you were sufficiently sensitive or psychic or well-trained and had a little knowledge of where you were, you could potentially have a visionary encounter with representatives of those, well, I'll call them alien families, although I don't like the phrase. Isn't anything better.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's I've heard Sirius is a big one too. And that's
thank you. Sirius and Canopus, those are the other 2.
Okay, yeah. Sirius is interesting. I've had experience actually because of one of your books, the Geomantic Year. You mentioned January 1st, New Year's Eve, as being a very important, New Year's Day, New Year's Eve, December 31st, as being a very important day for Sirius. And I did a ritual last year where I basically use the time instead of partying and stuff. I got to use the time to kind of honor Sirius, and it was a very powerful experience. It was my first time working with, I guess, outer planets, anything outside of the solar system, and that was a very powerful, intense experience, a very powerful energy, and it's something that's still kind of affecting my life to this day. What do you make of that, specifically Sirius, in your work? Is there anything you can kind of comment on that?
Yes. It's actually a very important influence. One of the aspects of the geometric design of the planet is that there are 15 very large ley lines that encircle the planet, sort of like a ball of yarn, but they're more like the size of an expressway in Los Angeles. They're not the little dowsable things that the British talk about. These are really broad highways, and they have a purpose. 3 of them correspond to what, if anyone has looked at the structure of chakras and the currents that run through them, or if you take the image of the caduceus, it's like a staff with 2 snakes spiraling around it. That's actually an image of these 3 energy channels. One corresponds to the sun, one to the moon, and one to fire. But they don't mean our local moon and sun. They meant more of a cosmic level. The sun part is Sirius, and the Earth has the same pattern. A line of light comes directly down from Sirius and anchors at Avebury Stone Circle in Wiltshire. And that's the gold line, or the sun line. The silver line, or the moon line, again, I don't mean our local satellite moon. Moon is most people misunderstand that. It's a realm of silver light to do with Mrs. God, the feminine aspect of God. A silver line comes down from Canopus. They both anchor at Avebury Stone Circle, which is a 28-acre stone circle. It's got really big, wonky-looking stones that are very, very old. And this is the Earth's umbillicus. This is where it plugs into the galaxy. That's why those 2 lines anchor there. And then they spread out and go and divide the Earth into quadrants. One goes this way and the other goes that way. And there are even, if you look at the structure of Avebury from an aerial photograph, there are 2 roads that go right through it. They mark where those lines are. One of them is Sirius. You can walk one of those paths, and I have. It's a beautiful place, Avebury, and tune into Sirius. I mean, you don't even have to know anything about the place or have any notions. The energy is right there, and it circles the planet. And then the Canopus goes the other way. Those are the 2. Those are like the mother-father energies for the Earth. So very important. And then Sirius has a lot of other places where it's represented in the planet. There's a feature called landscape zodiacs. It's a large concept. It's basically like an edited holographic imprint of the galaxy with a lot of constellations and a lot of stars and of varying sizes. A famous one is at Glastonbury. If anyone has been to Glastonbury in England, they would have heard of it, but it's a pattern. There's over 400 of them. And the most how should I say, you cannot expect to interact with that pattern unless you meet the dog. And the dog is Sirius. The dog, or Sirius, is the hound of heaven. In Hindu astronomy, and this is not even esoteric, they call the star Sirius the hound of heaven. It guards the cauldron of all the stars. And in my training, when I lived in Glastonbury and outside Glastonbury for a number of years, I was introduced to that pattern of constellations and stars. And the Ofanim said, you have to make friends with the dog first. Then the dog acts as your psychopomp and guides you through the star fields. And that dog is Sirius.
Mm.
So it's a big factor. And there's still another place. There's a feature on the planet called domes. And these are half sphere, like you take a sphere and cut it in half, and you put half of it on the landscape. Originally, they were 33 miles wide and 16.5 miles high, each of them presenting a hologram of one of the stars, one of the high magnitude stars. And the dome for Sirius lies over this famous row of 3,000 stones in Carnac, Brittany. That's in the upper west part of France. 11 or 12 or 13 rows of stones, like 2,000 or 3,000 of them, all of it under the auspices of the star Sirius. So it shows up in a lot of places, let's say.
Yeah. It's one of those mysterious, patterns that just kind of goes, every single culture seems to have a myth about Sirius, which is very much aligned with the concept of a dog, the concept of a watcher, and it's very, very fascinating. I want to talk about Avebury. I want to talk about Stonehenge and megalithic structures. What in your work, there's a lot of debate about what the purpose of these structures were, why they existed, why they were built. What in your work, what have you found is the purpose of those?
Yeah, excellent question. Well, first of all, this will irritate all the archaeologists on the planet, but they were not built by people. They were built by the Elohim. The Elohim is a mid-level management angelic family who were commissioned to temporarily assume human form as giants to construct the megalithic environment of the planet. Stone rows, stone circles, weird little hills like Silbury that obviously, well, they say it's man-made. It's more like it's angel-made. All of the stones at Avebury, for example, were precipitated out of the etheric realm by the Elohim. They were not quarried. That's a 3D materialist atheist notion that's completely incorrect. Avebury was created for a number of reasons, primarily to align humans with their own spiritual umbillicus, the Earth's umbillicus, and the umbillicus of the galaxy, which happens to be the star Polaris in the Little Bear. Stonehenge, everybody, it's sort of good that everybody goes to Stonehenge because then they don't wreck Avebury. Stonehenge is basically turned off as a museum piece. It's inactive. And also, people won't probably credit this, but it's been moved twice. It was originally in Southeast Africa. Then it was moved to Ireland. Then it was moved to Salisbury Plain in about 2500 BC. If you read Geoffrey of Monmouth's The History of the Kings of Britain, he says that, but nobody ever believed him. But the Ofanim said, no, it's completely right. It's been moved 3 times. Anyway, the stones at Stonehenge were originally designed, yes, they had a astronomical calendrical aspect, but that was sort of trivial. The main feature was to align human consciousness with the Christ before the Christ incarnated on the planet 2,000 years ago. To facilitate that. As soon as that happened, Stonehenge was irrelevant. It wasn't needed anymore for that purpose. Avebury has been here, again, archaeologists will cringe, but for millions of years, because you don't put an umbilicus on a body when it's age 10. You have to have the umbilicus when it's gestating in the uterus. So the umbilicus has been at Avebury since the inception of the planet. I don't know if the stones have been there since then, but they were put in pretty early. The stones also align. There's something in Buddhism that talk about the 6 worlds. This is particularly Tibetan Buddhism. Dead people, really cranky dead people, the gods, the animal kingdom, humans, a few others. And Avebury aligns consciousness with these 6 worlds, which are sort of part of planetary reality, but it's sort of in the background. It's not like people walking around and say, oh, how are the six worlds doing today? That's not quite it. And the stones at Avebury also align consciousness with the 14 rays that emanate from Ursa Major, the Great Bear, especially the Big Dipper part, 2 rays from each star, the 7 stars in the Big Dipper. The rays are sort of fundamental themes of consciousness expressed as bands of color and managed by very evolved masters called ray masters. They are one notch above what people know as ascended masters, which from our point of view are a lot of notches above where we are, right? I mean, that's all right. Otherwise it wouldn't be able to be of use to us. So Avebury also anchors that. And there's other features as well. It's a very, actually, well, since you brought it up, one of the other things it does, although you sort of need to be clairvoyant to appreciate this, is the entire light grid, all of its engineering details, is as if you had an engineering blueprint, is imprinted in this 28 acres of Avebury. You can access the entire planet from there. And from a psychic point of view, the entire planet is inside the circle. I know spatially that's going to cause the mind to say, what? That's not physically possible. But the thing is, when you're clairvoyant and you're working with, as a minimum, the 4th dimension of things, all kinds of crazy stuff like that is possible, where the rules of space and time are just irrelevant. They're just not there. Everything's very fluid. Anyway, Avebury is the most important place on the planet. It is, for geomancers, the equivalent of Mecca for Muslims, or Jerusalem for Jews, or I guess the Vatican for Catholics. That important.
So why standing stones? What is the engineering on a physical level, on a practical level? Why standing stones?
I asked the Ofanim this once. They say stones are very good for holding a vibration for a long time. Stones at Avebury, I mean, I've been there many times. I saw the Elohim precipitating them, placing them, anchoring them, and installing a kind of pillar of light in the same place where each stone was. And all the stone circles, originally there were, I think 1,700 stone circles. The designers like to use sacred numbers when they're coming up with how many copies they make. But all the stones are either emitting or equivalent to pillars of light. And often in the pillars of light are celestial beings that are acting like docents in a museum, showing you around. So that's part of it. So what is there physically is partly a placeholder. It's partly like where they put up a sign saying coming soon, a new shopping center here. That's a placeholder. They also can emit that vibration into the physical world to sort of purify the psychic air, so to speak, and to help uplift consciousness. They also facilitate visionary people having the possibility of a kind of visionary experience of those celestial beings and the realms they come from. And they also are meant to sort of gradually shape consciousness. If I could use the analogy of doing yoga postures, which, yeah, they're good for the body, but they're really meant to train the mind and the breathing and the rest of it. If we could picture the stone circles as sort of curating and shaping consciousness and making it fluid and malleable and almost capable of shape-shifting in a sense, as far as self-identity goes, the stone circles were there to facilitate that. Also, there are light temples within the stone circles. Sometimes there's a kind of geometric outer shape, one of the 5 platonic solids, like a tetrahedron, a dodecahedron. Those are 5 special shapes. And then light temples of various types. Now, let me explain light temples for a minute. Think of a big city like New York City. You have a big library, you have a police station, you have subway entrances, you have skyscrapers. They're all different architectural types of buildings. Well, light temples are like that. There's a whole range of them. Or if you take a Gothic cathedral and picture that it's made of light instead of stone. And then picture that as residing somewhere in the landscape that you can see if you're psychic. And then the purpose of a light temple is to facilitate a specific kind of experience. The goal, you see, is to help humanity, maybe one person at a time, to wake up to the truth of their cosmic origin and design. We're not just intelligent monkeys. The design, no offense to monkeys, the design of the human is quite cosmic. And you mentioned your interest in Kabbalah. They do talk about that kind of thing. They use the term Adam Kadmon, which is sort of God's idea of the perfect anthropomorphic expression for consciousness. It's a complicated notion, but it does come into play in the design of everything on the planet. And the light temples are a way of facilitating step by step, incrementally, so you don't get overwhelmed, a gradual self-awareness of how you actually are comprised. And at the same time, you realize the earth has the same thing. And here's the benefit: the process of discovering this is also how you maintain the light grid and the physical ecosystem of the planet. You get 2 for 1. Isn't that cool?
That's really cool. That's fascinating. So the rocks, the structures essentially act as, in a sense, a hard drive, right? It's a store. It stores information. It's something that can be accessed later.
But it also emits.
It emits, right?
Even if you don't tune into it, it still emits.
Yeah, that's awesome. There's a area near me called Ringing Rocks. It's in Pennsylvania, and I went there recently, and it's fascinating. The rocks have their special quality. When you hit them with a hammer, they vibrate, they ring, and it's a natural phenomenon. Very interesting, very sacred, right? Very ancient place. And I looked on a map, and from that area, if you go northeast on the map on the globe, it goes to Avebury, which is really fascinating. And there's actually 3 areas in Pennsylvania. They're a very unique place. There's only a few in the world that are like this. So these boulder fields that, when you hit them, they ring. And all of them in Pennsylvania go directly to Avebury. If you go on the map, you go straight up. And I just thought that was, I was like, wow, this is definitely, there's something here. There's something sacred here. And when you said that the rocks, the megalithic structures store information and also emit information, it made me think, because when you go there, you see these archaeologists call them cupules, and they're indentations in the rock from native peoples and indigenous peoples. The theory is that they were using them for either fertility rituals or perhaps to influence the environment in some kind of magical ritual. And they would essentially beat on these central location on the rock until it formed an indentation. And when you said that, it just kind of made me realize that perhaps one of the reasons for that is because they understood that the rock stored information that they, in a sense, and so they were essentially trying to access that. So they would take the powder and they would use it in rituals and whatnot, which I thought was fascinating. And in your books, you mentioned that native peoples, a lot of the times, they were essentially the mechanics of the light grid. Can you kind of expand on that a little bit?
Let's say, yeah, there are allusions in Native American mythology, especially in America, that the variously called sky fathers or sky people or star people, whatever term they use translated into English, originally instructed them in the procedures or protocols of interaction with the subtle landscape. That was a very long time ago. Let's say, and I don't mean any disrespect to native peoples, that over time that information was subject to entropy, abridgment, deletion, redaction, corruption. People forgot stuff. Other parts were deliberately changed, like all the editing of the Bible, for example, is certainly not the way it was originally presented at what you have now. So over time, the correct protocols have sort of gotten forgotten or distorted. And again, no disrespect to those people, but you don't need to hit the rocks to get the benefit of the place. That's sort of, I don't want to insult anyone, but it's sort of a degenerated use of the site. Because you just don't need to do that. You just need to insert your consciousness. Think of your consciousness as like an electrical plug, and the sacred site or the stone circle as the outlet on the wall. You put the plug in the wall, you've got electricity running in the room or the light as you wish. When you put your consciousness and you plug it into the node, the stone circle or any other feature, you get the electricity running through your consciousness. Electricity in this analogy means a kind of upgraded cosmic level of awareness, or you just begin to understand a little bit of how angels think, or Great White Brotherhood members think, or just the design of reality, which is more than the 3D world of matter and materialism that we take for granted. That's just like the outer skin of everything. The light grid is how you penetrate beyond the skin into the reality of it, or the fruit in that example.
Fascinating. So I kind of want to touch on the concept of giants. So you mentioned the Elohim were the builders of these megalithic structures. I've heard that giants were the result of breeding between angels and human females, and that they were essentially negative. They were destructive, and there's a whole myth of Noah's Ark and the flood that to destroy them. What are your thoughts on all that?
That is all classic disinformation and totally wrong. It's complicated. There have been four orders of four angelic families that have incarnated as giants over time. The one you're referring to is called the Nephilim. And the Nephilim, they have a bad reputation in the West, sort of deliberately. It's just like, you have to think espionage and disinformation and the way one country will trash the reputation of another, because they're totally misrepresented. The Nephilim are known in Hinduism as the Gandharvas and Apsaras. The Gandharvas are the masculine expression. They're presented as very elegantly outfitted male angels playing lutes, and the Apsaras are the female angels dancing to the music, and they love humanity. Hindu myths emphasize that. Well, the Nephilim are periodically asked to facilitate a genetic upgrade in humanity. And the last time they did this was in Polynesia, in the area that we now know as Polynesia, Tahiti and all those islands out there, all the way out to Hawaii. And with Supreme Being's permission, they actually upgraded the human genome. Yes, they mated with human females, but it was totally by permission and divine commission. And the result was the Polynesian people, who, if anyone has been to Polynesia, you'll probably agree it's a very nice vibe. I mean, it's sort of different than anything you'll encounter in America. So somehow they just became the scapegoat for everything that shall we say, the dark spirits and the dark lodges wanted to dump on them. And there are a few pseudo historians who've been largely responsible for that. I won't mention their names, but let's just say they really made a mess of the actual record of it. Now, the Elohim were the first ones. They were commissioned before humans were even installed on the planet to establish the geomantic and megalithic, that means big stones, landscape. And according to the Ofanim, they took the form of giants, 18 feet tall. I said, how come they had to be so big? It said, basically, there are a lot of sort of tough, angry animals around, probably the dinosaurs, that otherwise would have been a problem. I mean, that's sort of not important. The interesting thing about the Elohim is that they were the original Cyclopes. That's from Greek mythology. If you read the Odyssey, Odysseus is in a cave and he's being held captive by a really dumb oaf giant called Polyphemus. He has one big eye in the center of his forehead, and he's sort of a moron, easily tricked. Well, that's the Greeks. They like to play up things like that. The truth of it is, the Elohim were cyclopean with that third eye, because what it meant was, if you take the 7 chakras that every human has, from the bottom of the spine to the crown, they're like wheels, and each facilitates a level of cognition. Everybody has them, and the wheels have either spokes, or you can picture them as petals, like on a flower. If you take all of those chakras and put them all in the same room, like a big cocktail party or a big assembly, and that's the brow chakra, which is not just the little point in the front, it's actually the whole space of the head. It's like a big room. You put the 1,050 petals in there. That is what generates the third eye, the cyclopean eye, the eye of the cyclope. And what it means is, the Elohim as an angelic order in fact, all the angel families had the same thing, never lost the unitive vision. They did not fall into the fragmented differentiation of the chakras. People don't realize that we have chakras. It's like instead of having one eye, in which we can see everything, we have 1,050 eyes, and it confuses everything. So it's a developmental, evolutionary thing to have the chakras, but technically the Elohim did not have them. They did not need them. They had that single eye. And that eye, I don't know if you want me to go into this now. It actually has to do with the whole basis of the Grail myth. But let's just say that eye was not only evidence that they were always in contact with the divine vision. In other words, think of the Supreme Being as the master designer. In fact, in Hindu mythology, there's this guy called Vishvakarman, and he's described as sort of like the way the Masons describe God as a geometer, like you roll up the sleeves, you got a slide rule, this 1950 kind of image, and you're in charge of the whole design project. The Hindus actually gave an aspect of Brahma or God that specialized function. Anyway, with this cyclopean eye, they were able to transmit a certain God power. This is something from Kabbalah, where each of the spheres of energy on this postulated tree has a name in Hebrew that represents a certain power. And the one that the Elohim had was called El, or Aleph Lameth. It had to do with the crown chakra, and it was a terraforming power. You could terraform consciousness or the landscape or the light grid with it. That's how they set everything up. It's not like they had to lift those stones. They basically just levitated them into place by thinking it. I mean, it's so easy. Archaeologists like to figure out how many people it would take and how many oxen it would take to train. It was nonsense. It was done instantaneously. They probably did it before lunch and then broke at 12 o'clock for a lazy afternoon. I mean, it was, from their point of view, quite easy. And they're still around, and they even have light temple. I'm still talking about the Elohim. They have their own light temples, a number of them around the planet, where you can actually interact with them. There's one at the entry to Yosemite Park. If everyone's ever been there, I mean, you're not going to see it unless you're clairvoyant, but there's a big copy of an Elohim citadel. It's like a round, like a big sports stadium. It's made of blue granite upright pillars of light. And inside you have the possibility of meeting with the Elohim, who, this is why they're relevant. They are actually humanity's godparents, because not only did they design and implement most of the geomantic features, you know, sacred sites, stone circles and whatnot, they also were instrumental in the design of the generic human being in the first place, especially its spiritual components. It was a group effort. I mentioned the Pleiadians were part of it. Some of the other alien families were also part of it, but the Elohim principally get the credit as being our godparents, our genuine godparents, which means they're still on the job. They're still accessible, visitable. In my early training with the Ofanim in England, they would periodically bring the Elohim to just have a chat with us. I mean, obviously, we had to be psychic to see them. It's not like they crunch down and fit into the living room in an English house where the ceilings aren't that high. It's more of a visionary visit. But we are introduced to them as colleagues of the Ofanim and as crucial, indispensable factors in the design of humanity and the planet. So I mean, there's a big story there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I kind of want to get into more of the detail of your work with the light grid. And, you know, you mentioned at, you know, the entrance of Yosemite, you're seeing it's a blue citadel, right? I want to get into more of into the detail and how do you see this? How do you, when you're doing your work, are you astral projecting? Are you meditating? You mentioned clairvoyance. Like how does that work from a...
Okay. Good question. No, it's not astral projecting at all. Clairvoyance is very much about staying in the body. It's actually harder to stay in the body than to project yourself outside. And the emphasis in the angelic realm is get as much of your consciousness in the body and stay there. And the clairvoyance is conducted principally through the brow chakra in conjunction with the crown chakra. They really work together. You could say the brow chakra is like the flat screen TV, and the crown chakra is the BBC a voiceover explaining what you're seeing. So you got a TV and you got somebody explaining what you're seeing. And this is inbuilt. Everybody has these features, which also speaks to the amusing point of view that obviously the Supreme Being intended people to be clairvoyant because, let's say, he allowed the human design to include these high-level chakras that facilitate clairvoyance. So clairvoyance means clear seeing. You're not dependent on spirits. You're not channeling anything. And you sort of know where you're doing it from. It's a very precise skill. It's different than being psychic. It's more of a mastery than just serendipity. Sometimes psychics, the TV comes on when they're not ready. In clairvoyance, you only turn the TV on when you want to see something. If you don't want to see it, the TV's not on. So it's not like you're walking around having a hallucination of higher reality all the time. It's sort of when you want to, and it's in a structured manner. The way the Ofanim come into play is they explained to me some years ago that if we bring the clairvoyance to them, they will amplify it. They won't produce it in lieu of our clairvoyance. If we bring it to them, they will amplify it or magnify it or intensify it. And it's partly because it's part of their job. They need to have a certain amount of humans able to interact, able to see and interact with this complex engineering template called the light grid. So their job is to help humans, provided they do their own preparation work, see it so that they can interact with it in conjunction with the Ofanim, who, in a sense, their, quote, lifeblood is implicit in everything in the light grid. So you bring your clairvoyance to the geomantic work, and then with the Ofanim, they will strengthen it, and they will also provide limited tutorials. They once said, no, we can't answer all your questions as much as you'd like us to. I was in my early days interviewing them like a journalist. We're not allowed to bring everything on a silver platter to you. You have to sort of ask the questions. It's sort of the covenant that humanity has with God that we have to do a little bit of groundwork ourselves, maybe just 10%. We do 10%, they'll do 90%. But if we don't do the 10%, they won't do the 90%. We have to put something into it. So a lot of my, let's say my introduction and over the last 40 years to these features has been a combination of directed tutorials from the Ofanim directly to me, and originally with a small group in England, complemented and strengthened by my own clairvoyance, which I acquired by training, and it takes a while to really get it to work right. You got to get all the bugs out of the system, which basically means your karma, past life, things that would contradict it or oppose it, or other factors. And then you have the possibility of having a kind of guided tour of the planet, but it's usually on a need to know basis. For example, in the last 4 years, since the COVID apocalypse, so to speak, 2020, there's been an intensification of involvement by principally the Ofanim, plus some of the Great White Brotherhood in the Earth's light grid, and with the projects of upgrading old features, adding new features to the old features, or adding new features altogether. That's been going on in an intensified manner in the last 4 years. So I've been participating in that with a few other people. Probably other people around the planet have too, but I don't know who they are. But it's important. You have to know what kind of place you're dealing with. Let's come back to that analogy of New York City for all the different buildings. As far as I know, there's 613 different types of light temples. You have to be able to distinguish them. Otherwise, you won't know if you're in a Grail castle or a city of the Raymasters, and you could really embarrass yourself or just do something stupid because you don't know what kind of building you're in. Or whatever your intention is, if you don't understand the engineering of it, you may have zero effect. So the Ofanim are there to sort of provide some guidance, provided you bring some competence to begin with. It's complicated. It's sort of the rule of the planet. You mentioned the law of one. Well, let's say this is the law of having a light grid. You have to participate. Not everyone on the planet, but let's say, I think I use the analogy of acupuncture. Right? Acupuncture is a very fine medical modality. I've had lots of it myself. It's a complicated medical model. It's got thousands of treatment points and a lot of meridians that are like subway lines with stops on them. Those are the treatment points, and a lot of complicated energy relations. If you're a customer of that, you don't need to know all that to get the benefit. If you're a practitioner of it, you do. Let's say the geomancers are the equivalent of the practitioners of acupuncture. They have to know that system to produce the right results in the person, to move the chi accordingly. That's what acupuncture does. In the geomantic expression of that analogy, moving the chi is like moving, to use that earlier expression, Christ consciousness through the light grid. Again, I don't mean it in the doctrinal sense of Christianity. It's more like an ineffable cosmic energy or state of awareness. The Greeks call it the logos and the Hindus call it Vishnu. There's a lot of different names. So I don't mean it in the standard Christian thing, because that's a radical cartoon reduction of this. Anyway, I hope that addresses your question.
No, it does. Yeah, I think so when you're doing this work, walk me through, basically, if you were going to do this today, for example, what would be your ritual to start? How would you get into it? If you can talk about it,
That's fine.
Yeah.
I'll try to keep it simple, because it's not that it's inherently esoteric. It's not like the Freemasons where you're never going to find out what the secret handshake is. It's esoteric in the sense that it's complicated, and I'm not going to give the full explanation because people just might not be able to follow all the parts, because I've been doing this for 40 years. I'm used to their complexity. But let's say from the beginning, they presented an interactive architectural space for us to meet with them. And it looks like a very upmarket rotunda. A rotunda is like a very fancy gazebo. 6 pillars, a gold roof, a gold domed roof. You step up make a few steps to go inside it. There's a big glass table with what looks like a diamond geode on it. And out of the pillars step the Ofanim angels. That was an original, or as an early interactive space image for us to meet with them. And however, we had to also access the place in every human being where the Ofanim are already resident. There is a point of light, what they call a pinprick, very, very tiny, just 2 inches above the belly button and 2 inches inside. It's not in the body and it's not in the chakras, but spatially it's accessed through that area. And that is where, in a sense, they can be accessed in any human being. If you've read any of Rudolf Steiner, he talks about the various ways in which the archangels and angelic families have representations in the human design. So it's not an unprecedented notion. So we have to access that point of light first, which puts us in resonance with the Ofanim anyway. Because if you're not in resonance with them, or if you can't match their energy even a little bit, you just won't be able to make any sense of it or even get there. But it's not impossible. It's just a matter of training. They spent a year or two teaching us how to match their energy. They did it largely through jokes. I always said these are like the fifth Marx Brothers, you might say, because they have a great sense of humor. A lot of jokes and antics and gimmicks. And it's a way of sort of training our attention. It's a bit like training a dog, I imagine, except we were the dogs. So you have to sort of bring something to this rotunda. And then the two of us, well, in this case, me and the Ofanim, not all of them, because there's 1.6 billion copies, but let's say at least 6. That's a minimum manifestation. Will go off to a site. Now, this is subtle. It's not astral traveling or anything like that. It's more like projection of awareness from the brow chakra without leaving the body. It's, it's just, I don't know if that will make sense to people, but that's how it works. You don't want to leave the body because it's too dangerous. You're exposed to all kinds.
Yeah. Is it more like visualization? Is that kind of, no?
Visualization suggests you're making it up. This stuff is actually there.
Okay.
Okay. One possible way to explain it is that everything that's in the light grid is also part of a human being in a compacted sense. I mean, think of, if you've ever watched any of the Doctor Who episodes with the TARDIS, it's a phone box on the outside, a huge spaceship on the inside. So bigger on the inside. So the information stored in us, let's say we're bigger on the inside than we realize. Plus, we have 6 subtle bodies, 565 chakras, and 49 layers of the aura. Right? Seven bodies. You got a physical and 6 subtle. There's a lot of storage space in those, right? And it's data compressed, so you can store everything. In fact, everything you or I or anyone else has ever been, all the past lives, even if you don't believe in it, is data compressed in your current incarnational form. It's all there. As a clairvoyant, when I read people, that means, look at their space to see why they hate their grandmother or something. It's all there. It's just a question of which file you access, but it's everything you've ever been is right there. It's sort of both embarrassing and exciting. Okay, let's come back to this. So I'll give you an example. In the last 4 years, I work with a small group of other clairvoyants. It's 2 or 3 people. This is not really a popular sport yet. It requires a lot of training, and you have to be intelligent, you have to be clairvoyant, and you have to be unresistant to actual knowledge. You actually have to have some knowledge of these things. You can't just go in there as a psychic and expect, love and light from the friendly angels or something. You actually have to be trained. Anyway, we must have done like 30 or 40 sort of assignments or expeditions where we would move our awareness into this rotunda of light, and then the Ofanim would relocate our awareness to a different physical location, and we would conduct geomantic work there. I guess you'd say in a conjunction of our brow and crown chakras. We're not leaving the body. I take it so much for granted because I've been doing it for so long that I realize it's a bit difficult to get the concept across. But let's say you don't physically have to go to these places to fix them. That's a key thing. For example, just this year, there's Archangel Michael, who most people have heard of. He's one of 18 archangels. There's 18 of them, not 9 or 10 or whatever. And he's the chief one for another 100 years. He periodically produces an overlay of the standard pictorial expression of himself as an archangel with a sword and shield and wings and nice blonde hair, whatever way it's depicted, as if in a stationary hovering motion over a landscape. 25 years ago, he created a projection of that over the entire United States. Now he's preparing one over all of Europe, from France to Ukraine, and north to Norway and south to Greece. And there will be 94 anchor points, or if you think of it like snap buttons on a jacket, landscape sites that can snap into the overlay, right? And I know this is getting complicated, but it's the only way to explain this. Archangel Michael plus the other 3 famous archangels, Uriel, Gabriel, and Raphael, have dedicated light temples that appear as jewels, sort of like spherical geodes that, maybe 1,000 yards across. They're not little, they're big, and they're sort of located above sites, not at ground level. So Michael has, believe it or not, 24,000 copies of that around the planet. So any place that has reported an apparition of Michael over time, which you'll find, in England and to a degree in France and other parts of Europe, it was probably because there was a jewel of Michael there. So what we've been doing is, with the Ofanim, they've moved us to various places where either there's been an apparition of Michael sighted, or there was a cathedral or basilica or abbey dedicated to the archangel. And we've been working with the Ofanim and the Archangel Michael to sort of anchor that site, or to snap button it into the overlay. And the rotunda would be, it's just our prime workspace. Think of it like in mining, you go down in a kind of elevator chamber and do the work, or like with electricians riding this boom and cup up to where the lights are. The rotunda sort of functions like that. It's sort of where you do the work from. It guarantees that we're always in alignment with the Ofanim, because their energy is essential for any changes, as well as if we can't figure out what we're doing, they can always drop us a few clues.
Yeah.
And it's also safe because, this light grid is nice, as being spiritual with angels is nice, but there's a whole other hierarchy out there of people who aren't nice, known as the dark hierarchy, so to speak, or the demonic realm, or there's different names for it. In Jewish mysticism, it's called the Sitra Akra. I apologize if I pronounced it wrong, but it means the other side, the bad guys, the dark spirits. So part of the necessity to be trained as a clairvoyant is so you don't get overwhelmed by all the dark spirits. Because everyone does not like the earth, and everyone did not approve of the supreme being awarding humans such fabulous free will and a fantastically designed planet. They're still resentful of the old man for having done that. And they've been opposed to humanity ever since humanity was created here. So if you're not well trained, you could walk out of a sacred site completely covered in toxic energy.
Interesting. Yeah. And you mentioned in one of your books that some of the dark spirits are from pre-Atlantean times, and that they were the original humans, or original beings who had psychic abilities, and I apologize if I'm misremembering some details on that, but they essentially were black magicians, and they were part of the first iteration of Earth. Is it? Am I remembering that correctly?
Well, let's say that's partly the case, but let's expand the picture a little bit. There's a story in the Mahabharata. That's a classic, huge, epic thing from India. It means great India. India used to be called Bharata, great India. And there's a little episode in there where Garuda, which is the Ofanim in their celestial eagle form, was asked by essentially the supreme being to go into this sort of giant clubhouse of the gods and steal the Soma. What Soma really is it's the uncorrupted consciousness of the entire 40 angel families. It's like outside of time, unfragmented, pure awareness before incarnation. That's Soma. That's the immortality. It's not of the body, it's of consciousness. So they were asked to not really steal the Soma, but acquire it, as they would say in, I guess, CIA language. Just go acquire it. And again, the Mahabharata presents this in a more dignified manner. I'm giving it sort of the American Mickey Spillane version, but let's say there's a big bar fight that resulted because the gods sitting around did not like the idea of the Soma, or unbroken, unlimited angelic consciousness, being awarded to humans as a possibility. So there was a big bar fight, and Garuda had to sort of fight off the people who were opposed to that and run out the front door with the Soma. Now, again, it's a story, and I'm exaggerating a little bit. The gist of it is that when the Supreme Being sort of informed all the gods, which included the angelic hierarchy, the Great White Brotherhood, and again, what we call the alien ET families, many of which are much more evolved than humans, have been around longer, and they're used to their privileges. Think of an aristocracy being really irritated with the kitchen staff claiming equal rights, if you're in England, or think Downton Abbey, right? So they've been roughly about, I don't know, maybe a third to a half of the alien families have been opposed to the human project ever since it began. Think of it like a sporting match also. Baseball, or in England, like Lord's Cricket Ground. I lived in England, so I like some of the English stuff. It's more interesting in American. Anyway, let's say you're placing a bet. 30% are going to place a bet that they lose, that the humans fail, they screw up their free will. 30% are going to bet that they succeed, and 30% are going to remain neutral and watch it. That's pretty much the state of the planet. So what you're referring to would be more recent acolytes that joined the legion of those opposed to the human free will experiment and are seeking to disrupt it, cancel it, end it, take it off planet, suppress the consciousness, whatever. It's been going on since the planet began. And if I can segue to this, January 1st, 2020, as most people know, reality seemed to change on the planet because two things were happening simultaneously. One, the long anticipated golden age, or Satya Yuga, the age of truth, began on January 1st, 2020. I know this because the Ofanim told me in 1984 that it would start January 1st, 2020. So it's sort of a reputable source for that information. And that meant 1.7 million years of the best possible conditions for consciousness imaginable. We had just finished Kali Yuga, which is the worst possible, right? Yeah. It's the absolute, in acupuncture, you would say extremely bad yin to beginning good yang. At the same time, what Steiner used to refer to the dark lodges, which are still around. It's more popularly known as deep state, secret government, shadow government, not the US government, they're just the puppets, the layers behind all that, all around the world. They launched a well-planned assault against human freedom. And the COVID thing was part of it. The lockdowns were part of it. But the thing was, they realized it was like a last gasp or a Hail Mary effort to maintain control, because they knew that their time was limited. Think of this, picture this. You built a very elaborate castle out of sand at low tide. And now the high tide's coming in, it's going to ruin your castle. That's the Satya Yuga coming in. So the dark lodges have a limited amount of time left to run all of their machinations against humanity. What happened in 2020 is you had these two parallel lines happening, fabulous light coming in, and a last gasp effort to suppress that light by the dark grid forces, so to speak, supported by temporarily malefic astrology. There was this awful, it was like 2 years of the worst possible astrology. If you were in favor of the light, if you were in favor of totally screwing up humanity, it was the best possible conditions in which to do it. And they knew it. Despite all the ridicule that is awarded in public regarding astrology, all world leaders and planners use it all the time. I mean, it's just, they just don't want people to know it. So that was all carefully planned because the astrology was terrible and totally supported the secret government. But that's changed. It's no longer there. So everything they're doing is sort of last gasp. Now, here's where it ties into our whole topic, is that all of this, even though it looks like, you know, the COVID and the so-called solution for it and all the physical things that went with it took place in the physical world, the battle is really taking place in the light grid. You could say Christ versus Antichrist, if you don't mind those terms. And so knowledge of the light grid is essential to understand what's happening on the planet right now. You won't understand if you just look at the surface phenomenon. This is too much is veiled. And at the same time, the light grid is how you fix it. I was of draft age during the Vietnam War. Unfortunately, I didn't get drafted, probably because I can't see without my glasses. But it appears that the way the Viet Cong defeated the American military was through what's called guerrilla action, sort of sideways, stealth, unexpected little attacks. They gradually, by attrition, wore down the U.S. war machine. Okay, well, let's take that as an analogy. The way the angelic realm, the Great White Brotherhood, is nudging humanity and taking advantage of the Satya Yuga influx is incremental, sort of sideways things where people aren't looking. It's not nasty or coercive or anything. It's just more like tactically brilliant, because they have to abide by the covenant of you can't directly intervene. But at the same time, it's essential that this new energy gets anchored on the planet, and the old Kali Yuga, Dark Lodge stuff basically gets dissolved and erased, because it is not capable of matching the new vibration that's on the planet. There's a big struggle. They just don't want to give up. Sort of like Saruman at the end of The Lord of the Rings, even though after he was defeated, he was still cranky enough to go wreck the Hobbits' town for a while. It was a bit like that. It was a last gasp demonstration of his powers. So again, knowledge of the light grid is the only way you can really understand what's going on the planet. And there's an additional factor. I hope you don't mind me going on about this.
No, absolutely.
The light grid, there's many layers and aspects to it. One of them is geometric. There's a thing from geometry called the 5 platonic solids. These are 5 unique shapes. They obey certain rules that no other shape can obey a tetrahedron, an octahedron that's 8-sided, a dodecahedron is 12. You picture all of them superimposed upon each other, making a nest, and the Earth is inside it. That's a geometric aspect of the planet's light grid. Starting in 1986, per commission by the Supreme Being and the Great White Brotherhood and the angelic hierarchy, they started to add a second story to that. If you think in terms of crystallography, the crystals, if you had a crystal with 40 facets, it's now going to expand to 80, something like that. And so the next level of geometric forms are called Archimedean solids, and there's 13 of them, and they also obey unique rules. They selected one of them, and I don't know how they did it, but they in a sense seeded it in the original classic geometry so that over a period of 100 years, basically this century, it would gradually and slowly extrapolate its true form. Everything is happening in the physical world, including climate change, global warming, why everyone's walking around as if they're half demented part of the time, this sort of instability of consciousness, you might say, is a product of that. Here's why. The original 5 platonic solids corresponded with the 5 emotions and the 5 emotional chakras from the root to the throat. The new one corresponds to the brow chakra. It is a psychic chakra. It has no emotions. It is a visionary thing. Like, people will start having visions whether they like it or not. And in fact, they have in the last 30 or 40 years, Virgin Mary apparitions, UFO encounters, whether they're nasty or pleasant, crop circles. There have been a lot of symptoms bleeding through into mass cultures suggesting, and people remembering past lives. That's a key thing. The sort of fourth dimensional fluid, past, present, and future all in the same place kind of experiences. This new upgrade to the light grid, which has been underway for almost 40 years, is behind all of that. And people are, shall we say, the shadow government has learned, thanks to Christianity, a good way to control people is through guilt, blame, and punishment. So if you make people feel that they're responsible for global warming because they use too much carbon or they have too many carbon footprints, it's a great way to get them in line to be obedient. The carbon thing is trivial. It's a trivial component. The main thing is it's an unavoidable change facilitated by this geometric upgrade. We're not responsible. It's not our fault. Yeah, use less carbon, sure. But that's not the main reason. It's a designed and curated upgrade. It's supposed to happen. Yes, you're going to lose some oceanfront property. Greenland might lose all its ice. But what good is the ice? I mean, if you ever read C.S. Lewis's Narnia stories, the first thing that happens when these 4 kids from our physical world show up in Narnia is they automatically defeat the Ice Queen, who had turned the entire realm of Narnia to ice and frozen all the people into statues. Well, the picture there is that the condition of ice was not a natural state, but an aberrational state. So it's my belief that less ice, more landscape is better, because places like Greenland, Arctic, North Pole, and South Pole have geomantic features as well that are normally inaccessible. It'd be like having an arm and a leg that you couldn't use. They were permanently anesthetized. You can still walk around, but the full use of your body was not available. Full use of the planet is not available. So this upgrade, it's being carefully superintended by the good guys, so to speak. It's not a disaster at all, and you can't stop it. Forget it. It's not going to be stopped. They don't want it to be stopped. There's no need to stop it. You just have to be patient. Maybe if you live in Boston, it's not the greatest place, because maybe the sea level will rise, but overall the planet will actually be in better shape when it's over.
So that's really fascinating, because in going back to the Law of One channeling, they speak about these earth changes and things like earthquakes and tsunamis, floods, stuff like that are the result of an increase of energy that has to be released, right? And so, or sorry, like blocked energy, like a block in the chakra, so to speak, that has to be. And so the physical manifestation of that in some cases is earthquakes and earth changes and things like that. And they speak about how, there are two possible futures, right? Two possible things that can happen. One is a very rapid change, right? Where massive earth changes happen, lots of people lose their life, so to speak, right? Apocalyptic scenario. The other part is a gradual change, kind of a smoothing out. You're going to have ripples here and there, but things will smooth until finally the light grid is installed and everything is kind of in that new age. What are your thoughts on that? Is that something that resonates, or is that?
No, I would place it in between those two possibilities. On one hand, there's no benefit to doing it quickly if nobody survives.
Right.
There's too much invested in the earth to screw it up again. So they're not going to do it the fast way.
Mm-hmm.
They can't do it too slow because there is a certain celestial, divine, and almost mechanical mandate and necessity that the resting vibrational state of the planet is now upgraded and people have to match it. It's part of that Hindu time model of the life of Brahma, which is 311 trillion years, and it runs through cycles, right? We're in this new cycle of the golden age full of truth and light. But you can't, it's sort of like, you have to think of it in terms of a dimmer switch. Like, people often talk about going to sacred sites and they'll make the statements afterwards that they activated it. Mm-hmm. Well, they didn't. It doesn't work that way. The best you can expect is to nudge the dimmer switch 1 degree out of 100. Mm-hmm. If you nudge it too many, everyone will go crazy because they can't handle the new energy and their consciousness won't absorb it and everyone will die and it's a waste of time. You wreck the planet. It has to be at just the right, it's like setting a metronome. It has to be set at just the right pace. That's maybe 10% more than is the comfort level, but not 20. Most people can upgrade 10%, right? And if they can't, well, they'll create a pathology and die and they'll, go somewhere else. I mean, it's their choice. No one's being forced to leave or anything. It's choice. But there's definitely an initiation challenge being presented to everyone on the planet. If you don't like it, complain to God, because that's where it comes from. So they've set the pace at a level that a reasonable amount of people could probably match given enough time. Not a week, not a year, a whole lifetime. As long as they show some signs of trying to keep up. It's subtle. It's not coercive, but it's not totally indulgent either. People sort of have to meet the requirements. The way I put it is, most religions talk about humans as being children of God, like you're a child of God. I'm not a child of God. I'm an adult of God. Supreme Being would like some people to act like adults, to take responsibility for their consciousness, their karma. Yes, we're not perfect. I'm not an ascended master. Check back in 1,000 years, maybe that'll change. But whatever condition you're in, that's fine. But to be an adult of God means you take responsibility. You realize you have implicit autonomy of consciousness. You have clairvoyance, chakras free of charge provided by just the fact you have a body, and act like you're a grown-up. And not expecting like Jesus or Muhammad or some salvific figure to come rescue you because you're too lazy to develop your own powers. You develop them yourself, and then you work as colleagues with these beings. That's really the mandate. But at the same time, it's set so that, as long as people are walking, that's okay. If they're sitting down and not walking, so to speak, they probably won't want to stay on the earth, as long as they're making some effort to move. Now, as to whether there's a lot of bumps and earthquakes and all that, on the one hand, and Rudolf Steiner explained this, especially to do with volcanoes and to a degree earthquakes. The earth, through its light grid, stores unprocessed collective karma and bad consciousness of groups of people and like whole countries. And periodically, it's just too much. It's a bit like the stomach vomiting. So the earth vomits. It's unavoidable, but largely it's human exudates that have been deposited, like psychic exudates been deposited, and the earth just can't hold it anymore. It has to throw it out. So it's partly our fault, you might say, but it's a collective thing. It's not like your fault or my fault. It'd be like the fault of America or the fault of Peru or any country where, and so to a degree, bumps and physical traumas and floods and everything are permitted to keep people on their toes. Let me give an example. In clairvoyant training, which is no different than initiation as it used to be classically described, it's just a different name for it. You're basically incrementally processing all of your karma from all the lives you've ever had. Rudolf Steiner called this the guardian of the lower threshold. He said if people saw this, they'd really be freaked out because it'd be like everything that is unresolved from your past lives, from monsters to creatures to bad deeds you did, is all presented there as one spectacle. In clairvoyant training, you deal with it a little bit at a time. Otherwise, it's too much. But it produces something called growth periods, which is a term derived from botany. Like if you give a plant fertilizer and water and sunlight, it'll put out new leaves. You could call that botanically a growth period. The parallel process in humans is that when you change your psychic ecology by removing a certain amount of, I don't want to get into the details, but unnecessary or unpleasant or unwanted or basically demonic content or unprocessed karmic content, your psychic ecology has to readjust itself. And that takes a few days or a week, and it can produce anomalous temporary physical symptoms, mental symptoms, emotional symptoms, which you have to sort of ride out to get to the good thing. It follows the classic description of physical detoxification. This was originally discovered by some Hungarians 100 years ago, especially for alcohol and I guess cocaine and heroin back then. The liver, in a sense, has to taste the poisons again before it removes them from the body. And the tasting of the poison is called, they call it the Herxheimer effect in medical language, where for temporarily you feel like a living hell in your body. And then when it's passed out of your body, you feel like a living heaven. And same thing happens in terms of clairvoyant training and processing. And the same thing is happening on a planetary level. So you could say the Earth is going through multiple and sequential growth periods as old, nasty content gets processed out of sacred sites and collective groups of humanity and individual people. So it's bumpy and unpleasant, but ultimately it's salutary and leads to a good result. You just have to ride it out. And if you try to medicate it, drugs, marijuana, or prescription, or the whole spectrum, you actually are circumventing your own progress. They feel better for a while, but you're actually retarding your own progress. You may not want to stay on the planet. So you sort of have to, that's why I say adult of God, you have to be willing to put up with a little bit of the turmoil, because basically it's your own fault. You wanted these multiple lives. The cost of doing business over 10,000 lives is called karma. It's like your credit card report. This is what you owe. This is how much credit you have left.
Yeah.
You have to pay your bill.
Yeah.
There's no punishment. It's just you put it on, you charged it. You have to pay it off. You hurt somebody, you did something bad. You have to balance it out in whatever way is scripted, you might say. Plus all
the great metaphor. I love that.
That's a way of looking at it. And again, clairvoyance helps because everyone in genuine clairvoyant training goes through hundreds of growth periods. Sometimes you just feel totally, I used to say growth period is really a question of whether you're feeling homicidal or suicidal, because it really revs up everything. And, I put that in quote marks, homicidal, suicide, just to sort of make the point. And the same thing is happening on the planet. It's in sufficiently slow motion that you might not actually see it. It's sort of like watching the sunrise or watching a flower open. It happens, but it's very slow. So the planetary growth period technically is slow, but it's popping up in a myriad of symptoms: political, sociological, geological, totally screwed up weather. Although the totally screwed up weather is facilitated by very ill-advised weather manipulation by pseudo clever people who stole the equipment and technology from William Reich in the 1940s. So that's very unwise to do that. It's sort of adding a layer of confusion to the natural confusion that's already happening because of the light grid upgrade.
So the way that people can help the light grid, if they want to do this work, is simply to work on themselves and kind of unblock their traumas, understand and grow spiritually themselves. Is that a correct statement, do you think?
Well, it's partly that, but what happens is Okay, if you genuinely want to work on the light grid, you really have to have some training. You need knowledge and some sharpened psychic or clairvoyant ability. There's no way around it. Otherwise, I think I mentioned this before, it'd be like you're a plumber called to a house, a big 5-story house, no windows, no lights on the inside. You got a leaky sink.
Mm-hmm.
Where's the sink? Clairvoyance is turning on the lights. Oh, there's the sink. Now I can fix it.
Right.
That's just, there's no way around it.
Yeah.
Now, the thing is, the more you can process all of this content from your karmic background, the easier it is to do the work. On the other hand, the work is going to precipitate that stuff being processed anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Because, first of all, the so-called sacred sites, I call them geomantic nodes because I hate the word sacred. It's a little precious. But the geomantic nodes, most of them are toxic. Most of them are just like the average human, full of karmic backstory. Nasty stuff, black magic, unwise rituals, or just entropy and neglect. You know, think of a house you don't do anything to for 100 years. It's not going to be in great shape.
Mm-hmm.
The sites. And the sort of the sacred vibe sort of fades a bit. And so at just about any of the landscape sites, you are likely to encounter a fair amount of nasty, toxic, demonic energy, which will, if you have the same thing in your space, it'll be like a tennis game and they just hit the ball over the net. And that means it's going to aggravate the same thing in your space. On the one hand, if you know how to deal with it, it's a benefit because then you've taken the trash out for 1 week. If you don't know how to process it, you're now sitting in the trash barrel. You follow?
Right. I follow. Yeah.
Reciprocal. That's my point. Everything is reciprocal. You work on the light grid, it'll actually help you wake up to your cosmic origins, and it'll help the light grid itself. 2 for 1.
Right.
If you interact with these sites and you're not prepared, you get slimed by whatever unprocessed stuff is in the site and also what is resonant in your own space. And again, you're in the trash barrel. The mental component of this work is you have to be completely iconoclastic. You have to be like a Gnostic terrorist. You have to break all the icons, all the established bases of knowledge. They're all either wrong, incorrect, edited, redacted, corrupted, distorted, or disinformation. You can't trust anything. You have to be totally empirical. That's what the Gnostics were, and that's why the Catholics hated them. And you have to disconnect yourself from all the standard cultural definitions of things, including what constitutes a human being. The 3 religions of Abraham, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, basically demonize the chakras. So how are you going to interact with the landscape subtleties if you can't use your chakras and you've got the officer of the Inquisition leaning over your shoulders to see if you're misbehaving? I mean, that's a little too literal, but it's in the background of everyone's consciousness for at least half the planet, because those 3 religions a lot of people belong to them and accept the premises. So you sort of have to disconnect yourself from all of that, plus the so-called Western scientific model, Darwinism. Most cultures, especially American, are far more atheistic than people realize. In other words, let's say you have a list of all the attributes of the Supreme Being, and you have the privilege of a line item veto of the things you're going to accept and not accept. And so Christianity goes through the list. Mrs. God? No. Mrs. Christ? No. Nature spirits? No, they're all bad. Feminine counterparts of the archangels? No, forget it. Spirits of nature? No, stupid, pagan. And all you're left with is the Christ, or Jesus Christ, God. If you're Jewish, the Shekinah, and a few archangels hanging around. So you have to sort of disconnect from all that because, and that's a slow process. I sort of was never normal, and I never either paid attention or subscribed to a lot of that. Plus Zen Buddhism helps wipe the slate a bit because there's really nothing. It's the opposite of Tibetan Buddhism, which is permission to hallucinate. But in Zen, you get punished if you hallucinate.
That's interesting. That's a good one.
I don't mean to insult anybody, but it's a different approach.
Yeah.
But you have to really empty your head of all these notions and start again, because they're either all old or wrong, or deliberately wrong. That's quite nasty if you think about it.
Yeah.
How old is the earth? Who created humanity? Where did it come from? Even this business of the Nephilim being the bad guys. It's all wrong. It's not true. you have to see through all that. Otherwise, you'll reach a point where suddenly there's like a Berlin Wall of some belief system and you can't get past it. And you can't thereby help the light grid because you've got this concept in your head installed by culture that, again, say the Nephilim were bad guys and they had unauthorized sex with human women or produced a race of giants or some nonsense. That's not true, but it's so deeply inculcated in Western culture, you believe it, and it becomes an impediment. So once you get past that, you do need to learn how to work with the angelic orders, because using the image of the dimmer switch, to actually move the dimmer switch, you need to have 3 hands on it, maybe even 4. Human, angelic, Great White Brotherhood, and nature spirits. All of them turn the dimmer switch 1% at a time, because they're all part of the same pattern. They all have to be part of it. You can't just be a cowboy and think you can go activate a site. Right. It's not going to happen. You're not going to activate anything.
You have to have some humility, and some, kind of understanding of all that. And I know you mentioned in your books that, a human representative is required to do this work. And I assume this is what you're talking about, right? It's kind of like you have to learn how to work with the angels, work with the Great White Brotherhood. But why does there have to be a human involved in order to do this work?
Because it's the human planet, and the covenant that Supreme Being made with humanity is they would participate in the maintenance of the light grid. That was the deal. It was a deal. It's like a signed covenant or a contract. And the angels, well, especially the Ofanim, Nephilim, and Elohim, agreed to act as sponsors, mentors, docents, helpers, friends, pals, take your pick, all of those, to facilitate that. It was just part of the deal.
Yeah. Fascinating. So let's switch over to myths for a minute. So the idea, and you have a term, I'm going to pull it up here, that you mentioned, geomythic sites. Can you kind of explain that a little bit and break that down?
That's a term. A guy in England invented that term. A guy in Glastonbury years ago. That's a good one. It means a myth that is deposited in a landscape in the sense that it is site specific. For example, in England, there's a lot of myths about King Arthur, the Grail Knights, Camelot, and all of that business. And there are certain locations. There's a place outside Glastonbury called South Cadbury Castle. It's just a big, wet, muddy hill with a lot of cow dung on it. There's no castle. It was a light temple that was the castle. But the local myth was that the historical King Arthur had his Camelot established there. Whether he did or not is not the point. The point is that is a geomythic myth, in the sense of this mythic event specifically happened here. But what that really means, because you have to understand what a myth is. A myth is a pictorial residue of an earlier psychic impression gained by an initiate, deposited in the collective consciousness as a guide for future interaction with the same site. Most people think myths are like leftovers from the uneducated backstory of humanity. No. They're all psychic pictures. And the psychic pictures are actually roadmaps and step-by-step instructions in the protocols on how to interact with the place. You just have to know how to read a myth. And so, that myth of King Arthur at South Cadbury Castle, I've been there a number of times. You have to penetrate it psychically to understand what they're talking about. And often you have to turn the myth around. In other words, somebody's parent is actually the son, and somebody's mother is actually the daughter. You can't quite take it literally. But like Joseph Campbell deserved enormous amount of credit for sort of introducing the idea of paying more attention to myth and looking at myths from multiple cultures as collectively contributing a picture. You can't just say I'm a Celtic scholar or a Greek scholar. You have to be a scholar of everything. You have to be sort of like a shameless pillager of all the world mythologies to put the picture back together. So that's what a geomythic site is. Place that has a site-specific myth.
So okay, that's really interesting. So the idea of, so would you argue that myths are archetypal in a sense?
No, Well, yes and no. I mean, there's certain archetypal themes,
Yeah.
but well, if I could, let's say all of the psychic experience and clairvoyant experience I've had with the Ofanim in the last 40 years with people on my own, there's been a lot of visions. I mean, lots. If we were in an oral culture and not our current one, that the content of that potentially could have been construed as myth and entered the mythic pantheon of a given culture. I don't mean that in a sense of boasting. I just mean that's where the myths came from. The reported experiences of psychics. You find this in pre-Islamic mysticism of Iran. And this is where the term visionary geography came from, which you were probably going to ask about. They didn't use the word psychics, but they'd say visionaries or something. They would have an impression of something in the spiritual world. And another one would have an impression. They would get together and share the experiences. They would call it a visionary recital. I love that term. It's a bunch of clairvoyants saying the cool stuff they just saw, but they put it in more formal terms. So visionary geography, which also came out of that same tradition, early Iran, pre-Islamic, says that the physical landscape, as you look out, also has a layer of a kind of projection of the celestial realm overlaid on it. Light temples, palaces, city of the gods, dragons, everything in mythology is actually real and out there, but it's made of light, so it's more subtle than physical matter, and your physical eyes won't be able to see it. Your chakras will. And it's a place that invites visionary experience. In other words, it's almost like after a while, the whole term of visionary and clairvoyance is almost irrelevant because you're sort of in that realm and you realize it's the template that is the basis of the design for the planet of humans. It's filled with all these different light temples offering different experiences. And most of it has been recorded and labeled in the mythologies of various cultures around the world, and is therefore still viable and relevant. Even a term like Grail Knights, which is sort of archaic, Middle Ages, Le Morte d'Arthur, the history of Arthur and his knights. A Grail Knight is just an old term for a geomancer, someone who knows the pattern of the light grid and interacts with it. And the horse part meant they could ride their emotional body, the Mongolians have a term for it. They basically can master their physical form and their body and their breathing and consciousness to be able to perform deeds on behalf of the Grail. It's a term that's still viable. Sounds a little archaic, but it's also sort of charming.
Yeah.
Early days, the Ofanim called me the American Grail Knight. I added to that cosmic, terrestrial, and domestic.
Yeah, Yankee Grail Knight. I love it. Yeah. That's awesome. So it seems to me like this is a fascinating way to look at myth, and it almost seems, and I, as you were speaking, I was kind of thinking, is it possible to pull new myths out of an environment that have not been?
There are new ones that are being deposited.
Yeah.
So a lot of the geomantic work that we've been involved in technically would constitute new myths. That's why I wrote about them in meticulous detail in all the books, especially in the last 10 years. Basically, records of clairvoyant interactions with all the personnel described and their functions described. Technically, that's myth. It's just, we don't really think of it in those terms now because we're not an oral culture.
Yeah.
This are mostly from the oral culture. New involvements of the angelic realm in the planet, that would constitute new myths. Brand new light temples or upgrade to light temples, or this Archangel Michael overlay over Europe that I referred to. Technically, if we were in a pre-literate culture, those would constitute myths that everybody would be talking about.
Yeah, fascinating. And so taking those and translating them into stories, right? And then you can even imagine translating them into movies or something like that, a screen story.
Yeah.
That would be fascinating. Wow.
Well, there has to be some way for consciousness and the mind to assimilate it. Like, I may not be the best example because I like the engineering complexity, and I've been involved in it for a while, and my clairvoyance is, pretty good. And so some things I take for granted might be a bit of an uphill thing for other people because of those factors. And so if you can translate it into a story in any form, sure, it helps. as long as you don't take it literally.
Right.
That's the thing that people, that's the roadblock with mythology if you're an educated person, which is about the worst thing that could happen to you. Or having a PhD or something, is that you don't realize the myth is an analogy or a plausible visual metaphor pointing to something beyond that is not physically tangible, but is existentially real. In fact, more real than the physical world. You have to see through the facade of the myth and realize it's a psychic clue to something bigger than you're used to. Usually people say, oh, it's not possible. Like the myth of Hephaestus, the smith god of the Olympians, working inside Mount Etna, the big volcano on the island of Sicily, creating gold thrones for the gods and accompanied by 3 cyclopes. And they say, that's not physically possible. Of course it isn't. It's a psychic picture. Right. It's a light temple. The Elohim were there. The smith god, yes, he was creating things, but it was from the solar logos. It wasn't just fire. Anyway, you have to know how to read the myths. I remember Joseph Campbell was a big inspiration for me when I was in college, right? I'm sure he's been for a lot of people. And especially in his Bill Moyers interviews from late 1980s. And somewhere along the line, he said, people can't see through the metaphors anymore. They can't see through the brick wall. They just take the brick wall as the reality. They don't understand what the metaphors are. In clairvoyance, we use the term plausible visual metaphors because the paradox is, once you see beyond the physical world, nothing really has a fixed form. Like the Ofanim, they're the metaphorical masters. They can appear as horses, monkeys, angels, bodhisattvas, birds, elephants in several guises. What's their true form? The true form, they once said, is we have no form. It's a technical Buddhist thing. But in clairvoyance, when you're looking at a person or a place, your psychic apparatus is like an art director that comes up with a plausible visual metaphor or analogy. You could say, well, the kind of complex 4 or 5-dimensional energy field you're seeing is like an elephant. It's like a white horse with wings, or it's like a light temple with pillars. You have to realize it's very fluid. It's not an absolute thing like you watch something on TV. If your TV is working, that's what it is. It's a car chase or whatever. It's a plausible visual metaphor. So most people think clairvoyance guarantees complete accuracy. It's more like reality is not completely accurate. It's shape-shifting. It's a lot of fluidity, where rules of time and space are not really being obeyed, so to speak. And as your clairvoyance develops, it'll seem like a light temple is changing shape. But it isn't actually. It's your art director is coming up with a better image of what it might actually look like. That's what's changing. So this is some of the subtleties of clairvoyance. It's just, you realize that reality on the other side is not really glued into one place, and the architectural form may shift a little bit. And even when you're looking at Great White Brotherhood members, Ray Masters, or angels, be prepared for a little bit of shape shifting to happen. Yeah, part of it. It's normal.
Interesting. Yeah, I think it resonates a lot because, if we take the Archangel Gabriel for instance, in a Western perspective, right? We have an image in mind of a a very handsome male figure, with wings. But in ancient Egypt, Gabriel was associated with Isis, right? And then you have in ancient Greece, it was associated with another god. So it was same form or same energy, right? Same idea, concept, but the form was different and based on the culture. And who knows, in 1,000 years, it'll be Gabriel will change to be something we can't even imagine right now, which is really fascinating.
Well, that's probably behind why Joseph Campbell selected the title, The Hero with 1,000 Faces.
Right.
To say, and this is part of the fun of comparative mythology from a psychic point of view, is you can find equivalent names and descriptions of the same light temple or spirit in 20 different cultures, and you realize they're all equivalent. You can overlap and superimpose and you get the same result. And the way you're sure about the result is it's not the fixity of appearance, it's the understanding of their function. What do they do? What does the light temple do? What does Archangel Michael do that's different than Gabriel? When you understand the function, what they look like is not so important. The function is, because ultimately they don't look like anything. They're all metaphors, God's metaphors. So Supreme Being had this amazing hallucination and said, I think I'd like to create a universe and all this stuff will be in it. And I'm making it all up. I mean, psychics often worry, oh, I'm making this stuff up. I always say, why worry about it? Supreme Being made up the whole universe. He doesn't have a problem with that. So of course you're making it up, but it's more like you are participating in generating a plausible image of something so that you can interact with it. Where's the sink if you're there to fix it, right? You don't have to know the total shape of the sink. You just have to know where the bad pipes are, so to speak. So, but awareness of multiple cultures without any affiliation to any of them yields a lot of useful results. For example, I mentioned Grail castles. That's a standard thing in the Grail myth. The knights search around for years for the Grail castle so they can heal the wounded Fisher King. They can't find the place. They get thrown out of it. That's part of the myth. Well, there's 144 copies of the Grail castle on the planet. They're not all called the Grail castle. I had a vacation once on this island in Tahiti called Raiatea. It's their sacred island of all in the Tahitian group. And there was a Polynesian version of a Grail castle above Mount Temihani on the island of Raiatea, but they didn't call it a Grail castle. I forget the description, but I worked it out. Oh, they're talking about a Grail castle in Polynesian language and concepts. It's also the case with nature spirits. Like, let's take gnomes. Like in Tolkien's world, the gnomes are the dwarves, except the gnomes don't fight and they don't have big swords. They're not cranky like Tolkien's dwarves, but it's the same idea. Gnomes have to do with the earth element, not the planet, the actual thing of solidity, rocks, earth, underground, roots, right? Earth, lowercase e. The standard picture of gnomes for people in America, the British Isles, Scandinavia, is somewhat like in Ireland, the way Rip Van Winkle described interacting with gnomes in that story. They're the small guys, bearded, mostly masculine, vests, or English called waistcoats, and red hats and boots and all this crap. That's a plausible way to see them, right? You go to Polynesia, they're described as little nature spirits with grass skirts. If you go to Ireland, they're the leprechauns, which is a typically Irish nuance to the picture of a gnome. So you could put a scrapbook together, or like a Facebook page, for 20 different representations of gnomes around the planet. It's the same order of nature spirits, and if you understand the function, the difference in appearance is just amusing.
Yeah, they're all kind of exactly. And I love the the analogy of how Tolkien depicted all these different things, like elves, gnomes, probably trolls too, right? I imagine they did
trolls. Are just big gnomes, right? They're misunderstood also. I've seen trolls. Gnomes usually about 3 feet high. Trolls are 5 feet high.
Okay, interesting.
Sort of like, imagine a teenager that just grew too big too fast.
Right.
And the Scandinavians, for some reason, are afraid of the trolls. Ibsen's The Master Builder, they refer to trolls about 12 times in a kind of like the ghost over your shoulder.
Yeah.
But they're just big gnomes. There's nothing nasty about them. I don't know why they're big, but there's trolls and there's gnomes in 2 sizes. Yeah, right. So that's the thing where you have to be careful of cultural attitudes, because they're completely benign. Gnomes are probably, of all the nature spirits, the easiest ones to access and the ones most relevant to anything to do with the geomantic landscape, because they know the micro terrain. I had a lot of early experiences with gnomes. They explained a lot of stuff to me in England. It's easier to access them than in America, because England is a more feminine psychic country just by design than America is. America is very hard and yang and dense. But on a number of occasions, Ofanim would say, would you please go to this site to match the equinox or something, and have your gnome show you exactly where to sit. In other words, I knew what the hill was, but where to sit on the hill, the gnomes would take me to that place as long as I believed I could see them and I trusted that I could follow them and wasn't making it up. And they would lead me to the exact place and a sort of point, and it was the right place. So they're the experts in knowing the micro terrain. Let's say a 10-mile radius of an area.
Wow. Okay.
They're actually essential part of any geomancer's collegial tool bag, so to speak. I've worked with gnomes since, at least 40 years.
Yeah.
Plus, they're fun. They're both sort of, half the time they're like wise elderly men. The other half the time they're like a barrel full of Harpo Marxes pretending to be monkeys. They can be mischievous and very wise. It just depends. Sometimes they need a little discipline or direction, and sometimes they're awesome. Also, if you have any interest in crystals, they're the go-to guys for crystals because they're in charge of them. They're in charge of all the crystalline growths underground. Anything to do with rocks, physical matter, plants, the roots inside the earth. They have a whole tunnel system through the earth. They call it the Earth of Earth. It's a version of the planet that has to do with the earth element. And sort of the other three families as well.
Wow, that's fascinating. And in your books, you mentioned landscape devas. So what I guess the hierarchy of nature spirits and those in charge of a landscape, right? Obviously you have at the top, the one infinite creator, right? And, the archangels, and then, but in terms of the earth itself, what would you consider, define a landscape deva? What is that?
All right. Well, first of all, deva is a Sanskrit word. It means being of light. Nice term. You could also say landscape angel. All of the different physical features of the planet, mountains, valleys, lakes, rivers, flatlands, hills, all have supervisory angelic presences. They're a little bit less than the 40 angelic families, but they're not quite nature spirits either. They're sort of in between. And their function is to act like a fountain that collects celestial light, and like a fountain spreads it out to its assigned territory, which would be the size of the mountain, the size of a valley, size of a town, for the benefit initially of the nature spirits, who are the intermediaries between the angelic realm and the human, but also for the benefit of the human realm to get sort of high level chi. That's acupuncture term for subtle energy, or prana. And there are millions of them at all kinds of scales. Like if you have a massive mountain like Mount Shasta in California versus a little hill, the deva supervising Mount Shasta will be, shall we say, in hierarchical terms, more of a big shot than the one supervising a hill. And then there's a level of coordination. Each country has a kind of master landscape angel. It's called an egregor. It's a term from magic. It means a watcher. And so the US has one, England has one, Ireland has one, every country has one. It sort of oversees their landscape and embodies the ethnos quality of the people that inhabit it. Like what makes a French person different than a German? Ethnos point of view. I don't mean the way people think of ethnicity today. I mean from a primary design point of view. If you wanted to differentiate humanity into different nuances, right? You have to be careful how you interpret that. And then continents have egregores or landscape angels. The original 9 continents of the earth, going back a long time, had one. Canada, America, and Mexico share one. And that egregore is based in the Black Hills of South Dakota, which is why there's always been a fight over who owns the place for 100 years. It's not just about mineral rights. It's also, that's where the egregore for 3 countries stands. And then the master landscape angel is known as Gaia. Well, it's actually Gaia and Pan, sort of Mr. and Mrs. I like the 1950s way of putting it. So Pan and Gaia are the primary landscape devas for the entire earth. They ensoul the planet and direct and inspire all of their field agents. From basically Gaia handles all the landscape devas and Pan handles the nature spirits, but they work together as a team. So it's a complex system with many, many players, so to speak. There's thousands of landscape angels at all these different scales. And again, the easiest way to think of them is like a sort of vaguely angelic form acting like a fountain. Receives celestial light, it spills it out into a given radius of landscape.
So the egregore is an image that a country has. So for
an actual being.
An actual being. So the United States egregore takes the form of an eagle. Is that Yeah. And then other countries. And so that's why the eagle is so prominent
in France. It's the rooster. In Ireland, it's a celestial maiden called Ariu.
Okay. Interesting.
That's why they call Ireland.
Yeah.
The Ariu land, they named it after their egregore.
And so if you wanted to understand, this kind of is interesting, just thinking, understanding other cultures and where those stories come from, where those myths, where even subtleties of language, you can kind of look clairvoyantly at the egregore in charge to really kind of understand that. Is that a correct statement? Would that be something?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, I read in a book by a German occultist that in ancient times, or at least going back to the Roman times, the psychics among the Romans were aware that if you wanted to capture a country, you wanted to first capture its egregore. Take over its presiding landscape spirit. Let's take France. The egregore of France is a rooster or a cockerel. It's an old name for a rooster. It's a male. That's, strutting. It's a little French-like. Anyway, it's based at Chartres Cathedral, where Chartres Cathedral is. They put the egregore where the umbillicus of a country is. It's not always in the geographic center of a country. Like Chartres is not in the center of France, but Ireland's egregore is in the center. So there's some variance. But on the negative side, if you wanted to take over a country, you take over the egregore first. On the positive side, if you want to understand what is the genuine ethnos distinction of, let's say, the difference between Irish, French, German, or Italian people, putting aside political sense, this is like going way back to the original design, sort of like, this actually goes back to the Tower of Babylon, which again is an incorrectly described reality. But the gist of it was, for various reasons, they confused the tongues of man and created 72, whereas it used to be one. Well, these 72 were the original 72 ethnos distinctions within humanity, 72 nuances, or think of them as synonyms. Like say you had a word and there's 71 other synonyms for it. Those would be the 72 ethnos distinctions. One of them would be the Irish, the Germans, the Italians. Of course, they weren't called that then, and then they were awarded a landscape, a specific geographically defined landscape, which is not necessarily the case now because boundaries have changed a lot. And their egregore would occupy the umbillicus center of that landscape and be on hand as a reference point if one morning a person in Ireland woke up and said, "Who am I as an Irish person? I have no idea anymore. I can't remember." The egregore would be the reference point for that. It'd be like the embodiment of the subtle soul essence of an Irish person. And this would be true of all the other countries.
Fascinating.
That's how the world is put together.
Yeah. So fascinating. And it's so interesting because it's like we think of the complexities of another culture and the complexities of language and if we went to Japan, we would have, and it was the first time going to Japan, you had no reference. I mean, you would be completely discombobulated. But in another sense, it's very simple to understand the culture if you can access the very, the one image, the one concept that makes Japan, and if you understand that, suddenly the door opens and you can,
you would have to say carve away a little bit of the effluvia and extra added parts. Might have been accreted over time to get down to the core description. Often the shape of the egregore, like a rooster in America, the eagle, and other countries, it's one of them is a boar, B-O-A-R. It's different ones. You have to understand what does it mean if the people say we are like a boar, B-O-A-R, male pig, or we are like an eagle, or we are like a maiden, like the Irish egregore is a female celestial being, or what are we like, or like France with the rooster. You have to be careful in understanding what that metaphor means. Because it's not really a rooster. It's just the rooster is a plausible metaphorical image for a subtle soul quality. It will take a little while to really get down to the basic of it. You have to pare away the current sociological condition of the country, your opinion of it, the language and everything else to get to the basis. But it's not impossible to do it. It's actually quite fascinating.
Yeah, it is. And it seems like that would be, extremely difficult work to piece together. If one were to make a book, for example, or some kind of something that was just, the egregors of each country and an understanding of that, that would be really a fascinating project.
It's not that impossible. It just requires patience, clairvoyance, some knowledge, and geometric exposure. You have to understand the context. For example, these 72 original countries or landscapes not only had an egregor, which sort of emerged from the interaction of the people with their landscape. It was sort of a neutral thing to start with, and then eventually it turned into a rooster or an eagle or something. Mm-hmm. But each of these ethnos landscapes had a chakra template of 81 geomantic nodes. There's 81 chakras in the human body. There's 9 solar from the base of the spine to the crown and 72 smaller ones. There's 81. And every country has an equivalent template of that. And at the very center of that template is the umbillicus of that country. And that umbillicus plugs into the center of the earth, though not the physical earth, the center of the earth in its light grid form, Avebury, and the star Polaris, which is the umbillicus of the Milky Way galaxy. So each country, like let's take Chartres, that's the umbillicus of France, has that 3-way plug-in with the egregor standing on it and the 81 chakra template occupying the subtle landscape of all of France. There's 81 guaranteed sacred sites in France, whether you like it or not, that are part of this pattern. It's very cool.
That's really cool.
One of our jobs with the Ofanim in the last year is we went to about 36 national umbillicus sites like Hastinapura in India, which is just north of Delhi, and Chartres and not some other places, and worked with the Ofanim to sort of clean out the piping, clean out the plumbing, because over time, these places, again, are subject to entropy, neglect, or deliberate interference. And if people, like take Mexico, umbillicus of Mexico is Mexico City. Well, there's a Mexican poet, forget his name, but he wrote a book called The Labyrinth of Solitude. I was thinking, how would you write a book about Mexico called The Labyrinth of Solitude? I went to Mexico City, found where the umbillicus was. They have the biggest cathedral in South America there, totally smothering the umbillicus. And you can't really physically affect a subtle feature like an umbillicus, but you can block the access of the physical world to it. So given that, let's say you're a Mexican, you lose track of who am I as a Mexican? Used to be an Aztec, a Toltec, an Olmec, all this deep, dignified background. And you can't remember who you are anymore as a Mexican because your national umbillicus is interfered with. Labyrinth of Solitude. So I mean, the title then started to make sense.
Wow. That's
fascinating. If you look at Mexico today, the drug problem and everything else, it's partly because the umbillicus is still blocked. That cathedral is still there, sitting on the umbillicus. It's a massive cathedral. I mean, but it was so deliberate. Of all the places they could have put it in Mexico City, they put it right over where the umbillicus was.
Wow.
The psychics behind all the religions. Forget the love and light stuff. There's an occult black side to all the religions as well, where they have some knowledge of this pattern, but weaponize it.
So in the United States, is the umbillicus the Washington Monument?
It's in northeastern Pennsylvania.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
You never guess it was there. It's too bad they moved the capital from Philadelphia to Washington, because Philadelphia would be much closer to the place, and it's a more geomantically sane place than Washington.
Yeah. Interesting.
That's too bad they moved it.
Yeah, I know. It is kind of a bizarre location if you think of it. It's, swampland and
it's only bizarre. It depends on your notion of who is running things, makes the decisions. From a secret government's point of view, it's not bizarre at all. Washington, D.C. technically is the solar plexus chakra in a very large energy body that occupies half of the United States. If you want to control people, you do it from the solar plexus. That's the chakra where your metabolic organs are. That's where the fire, will, and control and power center is.
Interesting.
That's what Washington, D.C. is. Philadelphia, it was a more subtle place that was better aligned with the Ofanim, and it had to do with this point of light I referred to earlier, which they call the blazing star. It would have been a far more sensible place. We could have ended up being more like Tibet than America.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's a question of who gets to make the decisions.
Yeah.
Not always the good guys. It's not always Great White Brotherhood. They can't really fight the shadow government. They can only sort of do the Viet Cong guerrilla tactics things with them because of that covenant of free will. It must be really frustrating to be one of those guys where you can't just directly intervene, which is what a human would think. Why can't you just come down and fix things like they did in the Greek plays? They said, no, we can't. We're not allowed to. They can fix it in a day, but they're not allowed because that would basically make God a liar. It would say, you have free will until you totally screw up and then we'll come down and fix it for you. That's not free will, and that's not being an adult of God. That's being a child of God. I once wondered, well, as part of the Grail Knight training, so to speak, is you get to discover certain things. Like I always wondered, okay, where does this higher self come from? And I had this, I guess you'd call it a vision, where basically everyone began as like a bubble of spirit popped out of the supreme being, let's say. And your first aura is your higher self. The first aura around you as a spirit is your higher self. Then later, you progress to what the Jewish tradition called the Tree of Souls, where you get, it's sort of like at Hogwarts, where you get the sorting hat decides which school you're going to be part of, Gryffindor or the rest of them. So this Tree of Souls, according to Jewish mysticism, is like a big apple tree, and you are now created or formulated as a soul, and according to the specific nuance of your resonance, you are placed in some spatial location on the tree. Higher is not better than lower. Lower is not worse than. It's more like affinities. So you could say you're placed in affinity with your soul group based on this vibration, and then you get your chakras and all of your subtle bodies, and then eventually you can physically incarnate. But the point is, your higher self was your first aura, and remains. Once you get all the 7 bodies and the layers of the aura, the higher self is sort of like an aura outside all of that. It's always with a person, whether they believe in it or not. Yes, the higher self, from the higher self's point of view, most of the useful information is classified and on a need-to-know basis, because if you knew too much about it, you would mess it up. So in a sense, they can't tell you because you'd screw it up.
Interesting.
It's frustrating. And again, it's not something that everybody talks about in America, or they have a sort of childlike notion of it. But it's like a guide that periodically might be relevant, other times less relevant, but often they can't tell you because if you knew it, you'd do it. You do it wrong. There's something that people don't realize is that every year there is a kind of liturgical calendar or liturgical geomantic calendar in which there is a succession of live real-time events on the planet in which celestial agencies are actually present and tuning into the earth and injecting light into it. Real time, right now, 24 hours. September 29th every year, Archangel Michael has the free run of the planet for 24 hours to clean out all the plumbing. Think of it like ley lines and light temples. January 6th, the Epiphany, which is not well known in America, the original Christmas, the actual cosmic Christ tunes into the earth for a week. It's like a parabola. It begins on the 3rd, peaks on the 6th, and ends on the 9th, in which, let's say, the Christ light, like a laser beam, that's too literal, but I'll use it for an image, focuses on a selected landscape site. Last year, it was a volcano in the center of Iceland. For a week, real-time, live presence, not theoretical, not liturgical, not biblical, but something you can actually tune into and be part of in real time. I think if more people realize that, they'd realize how well the planet is being looked after. And the real joke behind this is that this Epiphany tune-in, which means the present Epiphany means the showing forth of the light. That has been going on for 6,000 years. So people talk about the second coming of the Christ. It's already come 6,300 times. Because every Epiphany for a week is the annual rebirth of the Christ on the earth. Again, not in the Christian dogma sense, but as an actual authentic being of the cosmos, like what the Greeks called the Logos, right? Every year, real time for a week, the rebirth of the Christ through a landscape site.
Huh.
They're going on for 6,000 years.
It's interesting you mentioned that because I think Iceland last year, what wasn't there a volcano? Yeah. So you mentioned
it stirs things up. On the other hand, it's always been volcanologically active. But yes, if you induce the Christ light, it's going to shake things up a little bit.
Yeah.
But last January's Epiphany was the most, I hate to use the word amazing, but it was the most complexly planned Epiphany possible because of the number of factors that it included. I mean, each year it gets a little more, it's almost like the planners, sort of like trying to outdo yourself if you're producing the Oscars. We have to do better than last year. Well, maybe think 20 years ago. I don't think the Oscars are very impressive anymore, but when it used to be, they would always have to one-up themselves. So there's a little bit of that. I'm looking forward to next January's Epiphany, wherever it turns out to be. But that's something people can participate in. What we've done, like last year, we spent, I think, 20 man hours, so to speak, working with the Ofanim, preparing the site, cleaning out stuff. Think of it like if you're preparing for a giant party, you have to get the tables, the chairs, the umbrellas and tents and everything. Something similar to that in preparation for it. And then it's a 7-day event of pure Christ light without any dogma. You don't have to know anything. You don't have to believe anything. It's totally empirical.
Yeah.
Every year it's been going on for 6,000 years.
It's amazing.
And hardly anybody knows it or pays attention to it. They think Christmas, December 25th is the date.
Right.
It's like an empty room with a lot of people in it.
Yeah, right.
January 6th date.
Huh. And that's incredibly fascinating. So do you get knowledge of this
around November?
Around November, that's when okay.
To see what part of the planet would best benefit getting the Christ light. Think of it like acupuncture. Where do I put the needles to get the result? You got your liver energy is stuck. You don't necessarily put the needles in your liver meridian. You might put them in a different one. So wait till roughly November to see the state of the planet. And then they tell me. And I notify my little group and we work with the Ofanim for 2 months preparing the place. Not every day, but basically 4 hours a month. It usually takes 8 hours or 10 hours, depending on the complexity of it. Getting ready.
So that, not to get too political, but in January 6th, obviously in America has a very, connotation with a number of years ago when Trump, the presidency and whatnot in DC. Was there any relevancy to what you're speaking about for that date in terms of, or is that just separate? Or is that something else?
Well, that particular event, as I understand it, coincided with the official date where they count the electoral votes, which would mean that date was chosen a long time ago. It's sort of the same question as why do you vote for the president of the United States when the sun is in Scorpio, like early November? That's sort of a tricky energy. It'd be much better if it was Sagittarius, which is December. It's a more enlightened solar kind of thing. So you have to assume that must have been some thinking by the Freemasons and Rosicrucians who set those things up, that some of those dates might be suitable for esoteric reasons. I don't know if Trump was aware of any of that. I don't even want to speculate about it. And I was actually surprised because we were tuning into the Christ light and he was doing that stuff in Washington at the same time. I thought, wow. This is a surprise. But so that's about the most I could say about that. But I just want to emphasize the notion of real-time events. There's other ones as well. The Celtic calendar used to acknowledge 4 quarterly turning days, as they called it. February 1st, May 1st, August 1st, November 1st. Those are also real-time live events where one of the ray masters works with the planet for a whole day. And we tune into these every year and participate in whatever they have in mind. It might just mean like move the furniture this way or vacuum the ley line, so to speak. But it's still, I didn't quite address your earlier question. Why do humans have to be involved? I think it's the same logic that in Judaism, they say you have to have 10 Jewish men present in the synagogue constituting a minyan to constitute anything that happens there to be real and acceptable before the state of Israel or something. It's a sort of a notion that you have to have a certain quorum.
Mm.
It's the same thing with geomantic work. Some humans, at least 2, 3's better, 10's better, have to participate to make good on the covenant humanity created with God to maintain the place.
Mm.
Yeah, 2, you could do it with 2, 10's better, 50's better, but somebody has to show up just to represent the humans, even if it's just to put your finger on it, like to leave a fingerprint, a handprint.
Right.
To represent the human component, because the earth was created for humans and we're supposed to be responsible for it. And it's not really happening for lots of reasons.
Yeah. It's fascinating stuff. Well, I really want to keep going. I know we promised about 2 hours. So why don't we pause here, and I'd love to do like a part 2 interview. Sure. Is that something you'd be interested in? Yeah, that would be amazing. Yeah, because I want to get more into detail on techniques that you know and kind of get more into that. But I want to kind of keep a broad overview first and then kind of go into that. Yeah, this has been amazing. I really appreciate it, Richard.
Thank you.
Yeah. But yeah, so people can find you at your website and on Amazon. Your 34 books about this subject.
Well, about 28 I had to write a few mercenary books, like most authors have to write a few books to actually make money from. So 2 of them were on health topics earlier, and I wrote a book on Rudolf Steiner, which is sort of amusing.
Yeah.
I had to read 6 feet of his books, pile up.
Jeez. And that's dense. Rudolf Steiner is not easy to grasp.
It's an acquired taste.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he's an important contributor. He's as important to me as Campbell was.
Okay.
Different reasons. He actually helped me appreciate the Christ as a cosmic fact outside of Christianity, because it's, if you're clairvoyant or even intelligent, there's a lot of nonsense in the standard story in Christianity that you just can't accept. But where does that leave you, right? So Steiner shows you where it leaves you, which is a vast spectacle of the actual cosmos instead of one defined by dogma.
Yeah.
So it's valuable for that. If he had a better sense of humor, he'd probably have more readers.
Right.
Austrian, so what do you expect?
Yeah.
100 years ago, 150 years ago.
Right, exactly. Yeah, he's referenced a lot by people who seem to have a good understanding of esoteric topics. He's referenced quite a bit, so he's definitely a source of truth, I want to say, or source of good information.
An exceptional clairvoyant.
Yeah.
He would stand there and give a lecture and read images right out of the Akashic records, which is a kind of universal picture library of stuff that's already happened. He would just stand there and describe it.
Wow.
That's very skilled clairvoyance.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Well, thank you, Richard. I appreciate your time, man. Thank you so much.